At 68 years old, I discovered that the cruelest betrayal doesn't come from strangers or enemies. It comes from the child you sacrificed everything to raise, who looks you in the eye and calls you useless while you're still serving him breakfast. My name is Gloria, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling the person destroying both your lives. Before we continue, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let us know where in the world you're watching from in the comments. Now, back to my story. You might think you know how this ends, but trust me, you have no idea what's coming. Because what I discovered about my son Vincent wasn't just that he saw me as his personal servant. What I found out was so much worse, so much more calculated, that it changed everything I thought I knew about the boy I'd raised. The very love that creates us can be the same love that destroys us if we're not careful about who we give it to. 28 years ago, Vincent's father walked out on us without a backward glance. I still remember the sound of his car pulling away from our driveway for the last time, the engine fading into the distance like my dreams of the perfect family. Vincent was 12, standing in the living room window, watching his father disappear. I made him a promise that day, a promise that would come back to haunt me decades later. I told him I would never abandon him, that I would give him everything his father never did, that he would never want for anything as long as I drew breath. Looking back now, I realize that promise was the first seed of my own destruction. But how could I have known? How could any mother know that unconditional love, given without boundaries, becomes a prison that locks both the giver and receiver inside? I became a machine of sacrifice. Working double shifts as a nurse at Memorial Hospital, my hands cracking from constant sanitizer and hand washing, my back screaming from 12-hour days of lifting patients and running between rooms. I missed Vincent's school plays because I was earning overtime pay to buy him the designer sneakers his classmates wore. I skipped meals so he could have the expensive protein shakes he wanted for wrestling season. I drove a 15-year-old Honda with a rattling exhaust pipe so he could have a decent car for his 16th birthday. Every sacrifice felt like love in action. Every exhausted evening when I'd collapse into bed after doing his laundry and making his favorite dinner felt like I was proving something to him, to his absent father, to myself. I was the mother who would never let her child down. I was rewriting the story of abandonment with dedication and selflessness. Vincent thrived, or so I thought. Straight A's through high school, a full scholarship to State University for computer science, graduation with honors. When he started his tech company at 25, I was bursting with pride. My baby was going to change the world. All those years of sacrifice, all those missed opportunities for my own life, they had been worth it. I had raised a success story. For 10 years, Vincent's startup seemed to flourish. He'd call me every few weeks with updates about new clients, expansion plans, the possibility of going public. I'd listen with the kind of pride only a mother understands, the pride that comes from knowing you played a role in creating something beautiful. He moved to a trendy downtown loft, drove a BMW, took vacations to places I'd only seen in travel magazines. I was living vicariously through his success, and it felt like enough. But then the calls stopped coming. Weeks would pass without hearing from him. When I'd reach out, he'd give short, distracted answers about being busy with work. I told myself this was normal. Successful children get caught up in their own lives. I'd raised him to be independent, after all. The truth came crashing down on a rainy Thursday evening 5 years ago. Vincent showed up at my door with 2 battered suitcases and a look I'd never seen before, defeat mixed with shame mixed with something that looked almost like relief. His startup had collapsed, he told me. Bad investments, a partner who'd embezzled funds, market forces beyond his control. The typical entrepreneur's nightmare, except this nightmare was real, and it was happening to my son. Just until I get back on my feet, Mom, he said, standing in my doorway like a lost child despite being 35 years old. Maybe 6 months, tops. I just need to regroup, figure out my next move. How could I say no? This was my baby, my only family, coming home when the world had beaten him down. I opened my arms and my home without hesitation. The spare bedroom became his room again. I cleared out my craft supplies and exercise equipment to make space for his computers and gaming setup. I told him to take all the time he needed. 6 months turned into a year. A year turned into 2. By the 3rd year, I stopped asking about his job search altogether because every inquiry was met with irritation and vague explanations about how the market was tough, how his industry was in transition, how he was being selective about opportunities. What I didn't stop doing was taking care of him. Somewhere between making his bed and stocking the refrigerator with his favorite foods, I slipped back into the same pattern I'd established when he was 12. I became his caretaker again, except this time, there was no gratitude. This time, there was only expectation. The transformation was so gradual I barely noticed it happening. It started with small things. He'd leave his dishes in the sink, knowing I'd wash them. He'd drop his clothes on the bathroom floor, knowing I'd pick them up. When I'd suggest he help with household chores, he'd remind me that he was dealing with a lot of stress, that job hunting was a full-time job in itself, that he didn't want to burden me, but he was really struggling mentally. I convinced myself I was being supportive. I convinced myself this was temporary. I convinced myself that love meant making his life easier while he figured things out. But gradually, Vincent's attitude shifted from grateful to entitled. The requests became demands. The appreciation disappeared entirely. Instead of thank yous, I got criticism. The meatloaf was too dry. The Wi-Fi was too slow. The house was too cold. I was too loud in the morning when he was trying to sleep off his all-night gaming sessions that stretched until 3 or 4 a.m. The grocery lists started appearing on my kitchen counter like royal decrees. Not requests, commands written in his messy handwriting. Organic almond butter, the expensive kind from Whole Foods. Those specific protein bars he discovered that cost $4 each. Better internet service because his current connection was embarrassing when he was on video calls with potential employers. I'd spend my modest nurse's pension on his preferences while eating generic cereal and day-old bread for my own meals. I became a ghost in my own home. Every morning, I'd tiptoe around at 6 a.m., careful not to wake Vincent from his gaming marathons. I'd make breakfast he'd barely touch, then clean up after meals he'd leave half-finished on coffee tables throughout the house. When I'd ask for help, just simple things like taking out the trash or running the dishwasher, he'd wave me off with practiced indifference. "I'm networking online, Mom," he'd say without looking up from his multiple computer screens. Building connections. You wouldn't understand the digital landscape. I wanted to understand. I tried to understand. But when I'd ask about these connections, about these networking opportunities, about the progress of his job search, his answers became increasingly vague and irritated. He'd tell me it was complicated, that the industry had changed, that I couldn't possibly comprehend the complexities of modern professional networking. The friends started coming around for their monthly gaming sessions. College buddies who'd show up with energy drinks and takeout, settling in for 12-hour marathons of whatever game was currently consuming Vincent's life. I'd serve snacks like hired help, bringing them sandwiches and refilling their drinks while they shouted at screens and complained about work and wives and responsibilities. They'd nod politely when I appeared, the way people acknowledge service staff, but their eyes told the real story. I could see the pity, the discomfort, the unspoken question. Why was this grown man still living with his mother, and why was she waiting on him like a servant? The criticism became constant background noise in my life. Vincent would complain about everything, the temperature of the house, the speed of the internet, the noise I made when I was cleaning. He'd leave passive-aggressive notes around the house about things that annoyed him. The dishwasher wasn't loaded correctly. I'd bought the wrong brand of coffee. Could I please remember that he needed complete silence during his important calls with potential employers? These important calls seemed to happen frequently, always behind his closed bedroom door, but somehow never resulted in actual interviews or job offers. When I'd gently ask about progress, Vincent would get defensive, telling me that good opportunities took time, that he wasn't going to settle for just anything, that I needed to trust his process. I wanted to trust his process. I wanted to believe that my son was working hard to rebuild his life. But as months stretched into years, as my bank account dwindled and my own dreams withered, I began to wonder what exactly I was supporting. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon last month, during one of Vincent's gaming sessions with his friend Jake. I was in the kitchen, washing the lunch dishes they'd left scattered across the coffee table, when I heard Jake ask a question that would change everything. "Dude, don't you feel weird still living with your mom at 40? I froze, my hands still submerged in soapy water, listening for Vincent's response. Part of me hoped he'd defend our arrangement, maybe acknowledge the support I'd been providing, perhaps express some gratitude for the sacrifice I'd been making. Instead, Vincent laughed. Actually laughed. A sound so casual, so dismissive, so utterly devoid of respect that it felt like a physical blow. "Are you kidding?" "It's perfect," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his own entitlement. "Mom's basically my live-in housekeeper. She loves doing it, gives her purpose now that she's old and useless. I mean, what else would she do with her time? I'm actually doing her a favor staying here." The dish slipped from my hands, crashing into the sink with a sound that seemed to echo through my soul. Old and useless. My son, the boy I'd sacrificed everything to raise, the man I'd supported unconditionally for 5 years, saw me as nothing more than convenient domestic help. Worse than that, he thought he was being charitable by allowing me to serve him. I stood there, water dripping from my trembling hands, listening to Jake's uncomfortable laugh and Vincent's continued commentary about how easy his living situation was, how he'd really landed on his feet, how some people just had to accept their role in life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling of my bedroom, the same bedroom I'd shared with Vincent's father decades ago, the same room where I'd cried myself to sleep after he abandoned us, the same space where I'd made all those promises about being the perfect mother. For the first time in 28 years, I began to question whether unconditional love was actually love at all, or if it was just another form of self-destruction. At 3 a.m., while Vincent was in his room playing video games and shouting at strangers on the internet, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. I was done being old and useless. I was done being taken for granted. I was done enabling a man who saw my love as servitude and my sacrifice as his birthright. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 5 years. I looked Vincent directly in the eye during breakfast. He was hunched over his phone, scrolling through social media while mechanically eating the scrambled eggs I'd made exactly how he liked them, and I studied his face like I was seeing him for the first time. This was the man who thought I was old and useless. This was the person who believed my love was servitude and my sacrifice was his entitlement. But here's what he didn't know yet: old and useless women who've spent decades as nurses learn a thing or two about observation, strategy, and most importantly, how to heal by cutting away what's infected. I made my voice as normal as possible when I spoke. "Vincent, honey, what are your plans today?" He didn't look up from his phone. "The usual. Got some important calls to make. Maybe meet Jake for coffee to discuss a potential opportunity. You know how networking works." I nodded and smiled, the same way I'd been nodding and smiling for 5 years. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't nodding in understanding anymore, I was nodding in calculation. Because here's what Vincent didn't realize: when you call someone old and useless, you're also calling them invisible. And invisible people can do extraordinary things without being noticed. But before I could execute any plan, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. How deep did this betrayal actually go? Was Vincent truly looking for work, or had I been supporting an elaborate lie for 5 years? The answer to that question would determine just how far I was willing to go. That afternoon, while Vincent was at one of his mysterious coffee meetings, I did something that felt both terrifying and liberating. I went into his room. Not to clean it, not to organize his space, but to investigate. To finally see what my 40-year-old son was actually doing with his days while I worked to support his lifestyle. What I found made my blood run cold, but not for the reasons you might think. Vincent's room was a disaster, yes, with clothes everywhere and empty food containers stacked on every surface. But his computer setup, 3 massive monitors, expensive gaming equipment, streaming gear that must have cost thousands, told a different story than the one he'd been feeding me. I sat down at his desk, my hands shaking as I moved his mouse to wake up the screens. What I saw there would haunt me for weeks. Multiple browser windows were open, and none of them showed job search websites or professional networking platforms. Instead, I found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the son I'd raised. Gaming forums where Vincent posted daily, often during what he'd told me were job interviews. Streaming platforms where he'd been building a following, earning money from viewers who watched him play video games for hours. And most shocking of all, unemployment benefit websites where he'd been filing claims, collecting government assistance while I paid for his food, his housing, his entire existence. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what I found when I clicked on his banking information, left carelessly open in another browser tab. Vincent had been receiving unemployment benefits for the entire 5 years he'd lived with me. Not just for a few months while he got back on his feet for the entire time. He'd been collecting government assistance while telling me he was too proud to take handouts, while watching me drain my retirement savings to support him. The numbers were staggering. Over $60,000 in unemployment benefits, plus additional gaming income that he'd never mentioned. Money he'd been collecting while I struggled to pay our grocery bills, while I wore the same 3 nurse uniforms because I couldn't afford new ones, while I put off my own medical appointments because the copays were too expensive. I sat in that chair, staring at the evidence of my son's deception, and felt something inside me die. Not just trust, something deeper. The image I'd carried of Vincent as my struggling, grateful son evaporated completely, replaced by the reality of a man who saw me as his personal ATM and housekeeping service, while he built a secret life funded by lies. But here's where the story takes a turn you won't see coming. Because as I sat there, processing the magnitude of his betrayal, I noticed something else on his screen that made everything even more sinister. Open in another tab was a conversation thread on a forum called Living the Dream, How to Maximize Your Parent Benefits. The title alone made my stomach turn, but what I read next nearly broke me completely. Vincent wasn't just lying to me about his unemployment benefits and gaming income. He'd been actively participating in online communities that taught adult children how to manipulate their parents into supporting them indefinitely. Forums full of grown men sharing strategies for emotional manipulation, for avoiding responsibility, for extracting maximum financial and domestic support from family members who loved them. I scrolled through message after message, watching my son trade tips with strangers about how to make parents feel guilty for asking them to contribute, how to deflect questions about job hunting, how to maintain the illusion of effort while doing absolutely nothing. There were detailed guides on managing parental expectations and maintaining the victim narrative that read like instruction manuals for emotional abuse. But the message that truly shattered my heart was one Vincent had posted just 3 weeks earlier, right around the time I'd started asking more questions about his job search. He'd written, "My mom's getting suspicious about my lack of progress, so I've started leaving the house more often to maintain the illusion of networking meetings. The key is making them feel like they're part of your success story while never actually having to succeed. She's so desperate to feel useful that she'll believe anything that lets her keep playing mother." I read that message 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. My son didn't just see me as his housekeeper, he saw me as a mark in a long con game that he'd been playing for 5 years. Every conversation we'd had about his struggles, every reassurance I'd given him about taking his time, every sacrifice I'd made to ease his burden. All of it had been part of an elaborate manipulation designed to extract maximum benefit from my love. The rage that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It started as a burning sensation in my chest and spread through my entire body until my hands were shaking and my vision was blurred with tears of pure fury. This wasn't just betrayal. This was calculated exploitation of the most fundamental bond that exists between human beings. Vincent had turned my maternal love into a weapon against me, and he'd been using it to destroy my life while building his own secret empire of lies. But rage, I discovered, can be incredibly clarifying. As I sat in that chair, surrounded by the evidence of my son's deception, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could confront him directly, give him a chance to explain or apologize, try to salvage our relationship through honest conversation. Or I could do something that would teach him a lesson about consequences that he'd never forget. The decision was easier than you might think. Because here's what I understood in that moment. Vincent hadn't just lied to me about unemployment benefits or gaming income. He'd systematically destroyed my ability to trust my own instincts, my own judgment, my own worth. For 5 years, he'd made me question whether I was being too demanding when I asked for help, too needy when I sought appreciation, too unrealistic when I expected basic respect. He'd gaslit me into believing that supporting his lifestyle was an act of love rather than enabling destructive behavior. He convinced me that my concerns about his lack of progress were unfair pressure rather than reasonable expectations. Most insidiously, he'd made me feel guilty for wanting recognition for my sacrifice, while he privately mocked that same sacrifice with strangers on the internet. That kind of psychological manipulation doesn't deserve a conversation. It deserves consequences that match the scale of the deception. I closed his computer and walked out of that room with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in decades. Vincent thought he was playing a game where only he knew the rules. What he didn't realize was that I was about to change the game entirely, and this time, I'd be the one holding all the cards. But first, I needed to gather more intelligence. If Vincent had been lying about unemployment benefits and gaming income, what else had he been hiding? How deep did this deception actually go? The answer to those questions would determine exactly how devastating my response would be. That evening, while Vincent was in his room on what he called an important conference call with potential investors, which I now knew was probably just another gaming session, I called my niece Sarah. She's a real estate agent, sharp as a tack, and most importantly, someone who'd always seen through Vincent's charming facade. "Aunt Gloria, you sound different," she said immediately. "What's going on?" I found myself whispering, even though Vincent's door was closed and he was wearing noise-canceling headphones. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If someone wanted to sell their house quickly and quietly, how would they do it?" There was a long pause. "Aunt Gloria, are you in some kind of trouble?" "Is Vincent?" "Vincent is exactly the problem," I interrupted. "And I'm going to solve it. But I need to know my options." What Sarah told me next was like discovering I'd been carrying the key to my own prison cell for 5 years without realizing it. The house I'd been living in, the house I'd been allowing Vincent to treat like his personal hotel, was in my name only. As a single property owner with no mortgage, I had complete autonomy to make decisions about the sale. I could list it tomorrow if I wanted to. More importantly, in a seller's market like ours, cash offers were common and closing could happen in as little as 30 days if both parties were motivated. Sarah had investors on her client list who specialized in quick purchases for people in transition, divorces, job relocations, family emergencies. They paid slightly below market value in exchange for speed and simplicity. "The question is," Sarah said carefully, "where would you go? And what about Vincent?" The answer to the first question was easy. There was a beautiful senior living community across town that I'd been admiring for years, not assisted living, but independent apartments designed for people who wanted to downsize without sacrificing quality of life. I'd always told myself I'd move there someday, when I was ready to start a new chapter. Well, someday had just arrived ahead of schedule. The answer to the second question was even easier. Vincent was a 40-year-old man who'd been collecting income and government benefits while lying to my face for 5 years. He'd been participating in online communities dedicated to exploiting parental love for personal gain. He'd called me old and useless while I was supporting his lifestyle. Vincent's housing situation was no longer my responsibility, it was his consequence to manage. But here's where my plan took a twist that even surprised me. Because as I talked to Sarah about logistics and timelines, I realized that simply selling the house wouldn't be enough. Vincent needed to understand not just that his free ride was over, but exactly how much that ride had cost, and exactly how much his lies had stolen from me. I spent the next 3 weeks living a double life that would have impressed any undercover operative. During the day, while Vincent was supposedly job hunting or networking, I was meeting with Sarah, touring apartments, organizing inspections, and negotiating with cash buyers. I packed my belongings systematically, storing boxes in Sarah's garage so Vincent wouldn't notice anything missing from the house. In the evenings, I continued playing the role of dutiful mother and housekeeper. I made his meals, cleaned his messes, listened to his lies about promising job leads and important connections. But now, every lie he told just added fuel to the fire of my determination. Every dismissive comment, every entitled demand, every casual insult was just more evidence that I was doing the right thing. The hardest part wasn't maintaining the deception, it was watching Vincent continue to exploit my love without any apparent conscience or concern for my well-being. He'd increased his demands during those 3 weeks, as if sensing some shift in the household dynamic and responding by asserting more control. He wanted organic groceries delivered, complained about the house temperature, and started leaving longer lists of things he needed me to handle. But the most telling moment came when I casually mentioned that I'd been feeling tired lately, wondering if I should see a doctor about some joint pain that had been bothering me. Vincent barely looked up from his game. "Yeah, Mom, you should probably get that checked out," he said absently. "But can you wait until after next week? Jake and the guys want to do a marathon gaming session, and I'll need you to handle food and drinks." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What can I do to help?" Not even basic concern for my health and well-being. Just irritation that my potential medical needs might inconvenience his gaming plans. In that moment, any lingering doubt I had about my plan completely evaporated. The cash offer came through on a Wednesday, $15,000 below asking price, but with a 30-day close and no inspection contingencies. I accepted it immediately. The buyers were a young couple who'd been renting nearby and jumped at the chance to get into the neighborhood quickly. They seemed like nice people, the kind who'd appreciate the home I'd maintained with such care for so many years. Vincent never noticed the sold sign that went up in our front yard the next day. He was too busy with his important networking to pay attention to anything happening in the real world. When neighbors asked about the sign, I told them I was downsizing, which was true enough. I just didn't mention that I was downsizing by one very large, very expensive adult child. As the closing date approached, I found myself experiencing emotions I hadn't felt in decades. Fear, yes, but also excitement. Anxiety about the unknown, but also anticipation for a future that would be entirely my own. For the first time in 5 years, hell, for the first time in 28 years, I was making a decision based purely on what I wanted, what I needed, what I deserved. But I'll admit, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, when I'd hear Vincent laughing with his online friends, I'd remember the 12-year-old boy who'd watched his father drive away. I'd think about the promises I'd made, the love I'd invested, the dreams I'd had for his future. Was I destroying our relationship forever? Was I abandoning him the way his father had abandoned us? Then I'd remember the forum posts, the unemployment fraud, the calculated manipulation, the casual cruelty of calling me old and useless while I was sacrificing my retirement savings for his comfort. I'd remember that the boy I was feeling sorry for no longer existed, if he'd ever existed at all. The man sleeping down the hall was not a victim of circumstances. He was a predator who'd been feeding on my love for 5 years while feeling nothing but contempt for my sacrifice. The closing was scheduled for a Friday. Vincent had plans that day, another networking coffee that I now knew was just an excuse to get out of the house and avoid any possibility of being asked to help with household responsibilities. Perfect timing, really, because it meant he'd be out of the house when the moving truck arrived. But before we get to that day, before we get to the moment when Vincent discovered what happens when you mistake someone's kindness for weakness, I need you to understand something crucial about the psychology of enablement and exploitation. Because this story isn't just about an ungrateful son and a mother who finally reached her breaking point. It's about a dynamic that plays out in households across the country every single day. When you sacrifice everything for someone who gives nothing back, you're not being loving, you're being complicit in their destruction. When you enable someone to avoid consequences for their choices, you're not helping them, you're preventing them from growing into a functional adult. And when you allow yourself to be treated as less than human in the name of unconditional love, you're not demonstrating virtue, you're modeling self-destruction. Vincent had never learned to value what he didn't have to earn. He'd never developed appreciation for what came without effort. Most dangerously, he'd never faced consequences for treating the people who loved him with contempt and disrespect. My enabling hadn't protected him from the harsh realities of the world. It had prevented him from developing the skills and character necessary to navigate those realities successfully. But here's the question that haunted me during those final weeks. Was it too late for both of us to learn a different way of being? Could a 40-year-old man who'd spent 5 years perfecting the art of exploitation ever develop genuine empathy and self-respect? And could a 68-year-old woman who'd spent decades defining herself through other people's needs ever learn to prioritize her own well-being? I was about to find out, because in less than 24 hours, Vincent was going to discover that his safety net had disappeared, and I was going to discover what it felt like to choose myself for the first time in my adult life. But remember what I told you at the beginning about how this story would surprise you? Because what happened next, what I found in Vincent's room during my final walkthrough of the house, revealed a level of deception so profound, so calculated, that it made everything I'd already discovered look like child's play. And it confirmed that what I was about to do wasn't just justified, it was the only thing that might save both our souls. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything feel possible. Vincent shuffled into the kitchen at his usual time, 11:30, wearing the same wrinkled pajamas he'd worn for 3 days straight. He grunted his standard greeting, which wasn't really a greeting at all, just an acknowledgement that I existed enough to provide him with breakfast. But here's what he didn't know as he sat there scrolling through his phone, mechanically eating the scrambled eggs I'd made for the last time. In exactly 6 hours, his entire world was about to collapse, and mine was about to begin. "What are your plans today, honey?" I asked, keeping my voice as normal as I had for the past month of living this elaborate lie. "Same as always," he mumbled without looking up. "Meeting Jake at that new coffee place downtown. There's this startup accelerator program he heard about. Could be exactly what I need to get back on my feet." I nodded and smiled, the same way I'd been nodding and smiling at his lies for 5 years. Except this time, I knew exactly where Vincent was really going. Jake had moved to Portland 3 months ago, a fact I discovered when his girlfriend posted photos on social media. Vincent's networking meetings were actually solo trips to internet cafes and gaming lounges where he could stream his gameplay without me overhearing the truth about his secret income. "That sounds wonderful," I said, placing his orange juice exactly where he liked it. "I hope it works out for you." Vincent finally looked up from his phone, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face: confusion, maybe even suspicion. After all, I'd been asking fewer questions lately, showing less interest in his fictional job search. But whatever concern he might have felt was quickly dismissed. Vincent had become so accustomed to my unconditional support that the possibility of consequences had never entered his mind. "Yeah, well, we'll see," he said, already losing interest in the conversation. "I'll probably be out most of the day. Don't wait up if I'm not back for dinner. These networking things can go late." I assured him I understood completely, just like I had hundreds of times before. But as I watched him finish his breakfast and disappear back into his room to get ready for another day of elaborate deception, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: the calm confidence that comes from knowing you're about to right a terrible wrong. At noon sharp, Vincent left the house carrying his laptop bag and wearing what he called his professional networking outfit: jeans and a wrinkled polo shirt that I'd washed and folded countless times. He gave me the same dismissive wave he always did, treating me like part of the furniture as he headed out to continue his fictional job search. I watched his car disappear around the corner, then immediately called Sarah. "He's gone," I said. "It's time." What happened next moved with the precision of a military operation that we'd been planning for weeks. The moving truck arrived 15 minutes later, followed by Sarah and 3 of her most trusted colleagues who'd volunteered to help. I'd already packed everything that mattered to me over the previous month: photos, jewelry, important documents, the few pieces of furniture that held sentimental value. Everything else could stay with the house. But before the movers touched a single box, I had one final task to complete. I walked through that house one last time, not with nostalgia, but with purpose. I was looking for any evidence I might have missed, any final proof of the extent of Vincent's deception that I could use to justify what I was about to do. What I found in his room during that final search went beyond anything I'd discovered before. Hidden in his closet, behind old computer equipment, I found a shoebox full of documents that revealed the true scope of his lies. Bank statements showing not just the unemployment benefits I'd already discovered, but additional income streams I hadn't known about. Sponsorship deals with gaming companies. Advertising revenue from his streaming channels. Freelance programming work he'd been doing under fake names. Vincent hadn't just been collecting unemployment while I supported him, he'd been running multiple businesses while claiming to be unemployed. The financial records showed that over the past 5 years, he'd earned more money than I had in my final 5 years of nursing. He'd been secretly wealthy while watching me struggle to pay for groceries. But the most damning evidence was a folder labeled Future Plans. Inside, I found documents for apartment applications in 3 different cities, all dated within the last 6 months. Vincent had been planning his exit strategy for months, researching places to live once he got tired of using me as his personal hotel and bank account. He'd been preparing to abandon me the same way his father had, except this time, he was going to take 5 years of fraudulent benefits and stolen affection with him. There was even a draft email to a property management company, explaining that he'd been living with family temporarily, but was now ready to establish his independence. The email was casual, matter-of-fact, devoid of any acknowledgement that his independence had been funded by destroying someone else's financial security and emotional well-being. In that moment, holding evidence of my son's calculated plan to discard me once I'd served my purpose, any remaining guilt I felt about my own plan completely disappeared. Vincent hadn't just been exploiting my love, he'd been actively planning to devastate me even further once he'd extracted everything he could from our relationship. I took photos of every document, every bank statement, every piece of evidence that proved the magnitude of his deception. Then I carefully put everything back exactly where I'd found it. Vincent would discover those documents again someday, probably when he was frantically searching for resources to rebuild his life. When that moment came, he'd realized that I'd known everything, that his final betrayal hadn't been a surprise, but simply the last straw in a pattern of cruelty that had finally met its consequences. The moving process took 4 hours. 4 hours to pack up a life that had been built around serving someone who saw my service as his birthright. 4 hours to dismantle the shrine I'd created to unconditional love and replace it with something far more radical, self-respect. As the movers carried out the last of my belongings, I placed an envelope on the kitchen counter, right where Vincent used to leave his demanding grocery lists. But this envelope contained something he wasn't expecting, a complete accounting of our relationship that would change how he saw himself forever. Inside that envelope was a formal 30-day eviction notice, printed on official legal stationery that Sarah had helped me obtain. Vincent had no lease agreement, no tenant's rights, no legal claim to the house he'd been treating as his personal kingdom. As the property owner, I had every right to terminate his residency with proper notice. But the eviction notice was just the appetizer. The main course was a detailed invoice for 5 years of services rendered. I'd spent weeks calculating every expense, every hour, every sacrifice I'd made to support his lifestyle. Cooking 3 meals daily for 1,825 days, $27,375, based on personal chef rates in our area. Daily housekeeping services for 5 years, $36,500, using professional cleaning company pricing. Weekly laundry service, $13,000. Grocery shopping and meal planning, $18,250. Utilities, internet, and housing costs, $31,875. The total came to $127,000, money I'd spent from my retirement savings, while Vincent secretly earned more than that from his hidden businesses and fraudulent benefit claims. At the bottom of the invoice, I wrote a note that had taken me weeks to perfect. Vincent, you were absolutely right about one thing. I did need purpose in my life. I found it. Now you need to find yours, along with your own place to live. The new owners take possession on Monday. You have 72 hours to remove your belongings. Your gaming console is in the driveway. I'm afraid these old, useless hands get clumsy sometimes. But here's the twist that even I hadn't planned, the moment that transformed my calculated revenge into something approaching poetic justice. As I was placing that envelope on the counter, my phone buzzed with a text message that made everything about Vincent's situation infinitely worse. The message was from the state unemployment office, sent to my phone because Vincent had listed me as his emergency contact when he'd filed his initial claim 5 years ago. He'd been selected for a random audit of his benefit claims, and investigators wanted to interview household members about his employment status and job search activities during the time he'd been receiving assistance. Vincent's unemployment fraud was about to be discovered by the very agency he'd been lying to for 5 years. His secret income streams, his hidden businesses, his complete lack of genuine job search activity, all of it was about to be exposed by trained investigators who dealt with benefit fraud every single day. I could have felt sorry for him in that moment. I could have warned him, given him a chance to come clean or prepare for the consequences. But then I remembered the forum posts about manipulating parents, the casual cruelty of calling me old and useless, the calculated plan to abandon me once he'd stolen everything he could. Vincent had made his choices over 5 years of deliberate deception. Now he could face the consequences like the adult he'd refused to become. I left my house key on the counter next to the envelope and walked out of that house for the last time. The movers were already heading to my new apartment, a bright, modern space in a community designed for people who wanted to start fresh, meet new friends, and build lives based on their own interests rather than other people's needs. As I drove away from the neighborhood where I'd spent decades sacrificing my own dreams for someone else's comfort, my phone started buzzing with calls from Vincent's number. The coffee shop meeting had apparently ended early, or maybe he'd never gone to one at all. Either way, he was home, and he'd found my envelope. I let every call go to voicemail, then blocked his number entirely. Whatever Vincent had to say about my decision, whatever explanations or apologies or threats he wanted to make, I didn't need to hear them. Our relationship had been a one-sided conversation for 5 years, with him talking and me listening. Now it was my turn to speak, and I'd said everything I needed to say in that envelope. The voicemails kept coming for hours, sent to the blocked folder where I couldn't hear them, but could see the notifications. 17 calls in the first 3 hours, each one probably cycling through the predictable stages of manipulation that I'd learned to recognize from his online forums. Anger, then bargaining, then false promises, then threats, then desperate pleading. But here's what Vincent didn't understand yet. You can't manipulate someone who's finally learned to value themselves. You can't threaten someone who's already lost everything they were afraid to lose. And you can't guilt someone who's realized that unconditional love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's self-destruction disguised as virtue. My new apartment was everything I dreamed of but never thought I deserved. Large windows that let in natural light, modern appliances that I'd chosen for my own preferences, space designed for one person who mattered, me. That first evening, as I sat in my own living room drinking tea from my own mug while watching a television program I'd selected, I experienced something I hadn't felt in decades: peace. But the real test of my decision came 3 weeks later, when Sarah called with news that made everything about my choice feel like divine justice. Vincent had been evicted from the house by the new owners, who'd found evidence of significant damage to his room and had filed insurance claims for repairs. More importantly, the unemployment fraud investigation had expanded after auditors discovered his hidden income streams and false benefit claims. Vincent was facing federal charges for benefit fraud, potential jail time, and restitution requirements that would cost him everything he'd stolen and more. The gaming empire he'd built while lying to my face was being seized as evidence of fraudulent activity. The money he'd hidden while watching me struggle was now subject to government recovery efforts that would leave him genuinely broke for the first time in his adult life. But here's the part of the story that surprised even me. Vincent had been forced to move in with distant relatives in another state, people who'd agreed to help him only after making it clear that he'd be expected to work, contribute, and follow house rules like any other adult. For the first time in 5 years, Vincent was experiencing what it felt like to be accountable to people who wouldn't enable his irresponsible behavior. The last I heard, he'd actually found employment, minimum wage work at a retail store, the kind of job he'd considered beneath him when I was supporting his lifestyle. He was learning what it meant to earn his own food, pay his own bills, and appreciate having a roof over his head because he could no longer take those things for granted. Did I feel sorry for him? Sometimes. In quiet moments, I'd remember the boy who'd watched his father drive away, and I'd wonder if there was something else I could have done, some other way I could have helped him become a better man. But then I'd remember the forum posts, the unemployment fraud, the calculated cruelty, and I'd realize that Vincent's current struggles weren't punishment, they were education. For the first time in his life, Vincent was learning that actions have consequences, that other people's kindness isn't infinite, and that respect has to be earned rather than demanded. These were lessons he should have learned decades ago, lessons that my enabling had prevented him from experiencing when the stakes were lower and the learning would have been easier. 6 months after leaving that house, I was living a life I'd never imagined possible. I joined a book club where we discussed novels instead of grocery lists. I'd started volunteering at the animal shelter, where my nurturing instincts could help creatures who appreciated care without exploiting it. I'd even begun taking art classes, rediscovering creative abilities I'd abandoned when Vincent's needs became my sole focus. But the most profound change wasn't in my activities, it was in my relationship with myself. For the first time in my adult life, I was learning what it meant to have boundaries, to value my own time and energy, to recognize the difference between love and enablement. I was discovering that self-respect wasn't selfish, it was essential for any healthy relationship. The transformation wasn't always easy. There were nights when I'd lie in my comfortable bed in my peaceful apartment and wonder if I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to prioritize justice over mercy. But then I'd remember what my life had been like before, the constant stress, the financial strain, the emotional exhaustion of loving someone who saw that love as weakness to be exploited. I'd think about other parents who might be trapped in similar situations, enabling adult children who'd learned to mistake kindness for stupidity and generosity for obligation. I'd wonder how many families were being destroyed by the same toxic dynamic that had nearly consumed my life, and I'd feel grateful that I'd found the courage to break the cycle before it destroyed us both completely. The truth is that Vincent and I both needed to learn the same lesson, just from opposite perspectives. He needed to learn that other people's love and support weren't his birthright, that respect had to be earned through reciprocal care and consideration. I needed to learn that my worth wasn't determined by my usefulness to others, that love without boundaries becomes destruction disguised as virtue. In the end, selling that house wasn't just about teaching Vincent a lesson about consequences, it was about teaching myself a lesson about self-worth. It was about choosing to believe that I deserved better than being treated as a servant in my own home, that my dreams and needs mattered as much as anyone else's, that unconditional love could coexist with reasonable expectations and healthy boundaries. Today, almost a year later, Vincent and I have no contact. I don't know if he's learned from his experiences or if he's simply waiting for the next opportunity to exploit someone's kindness. I don't know if he's developed genuine empathy or if he's just gotten better at hiding his resentment. What I do know is that his growth is no longer my responsibility, and my happiness is no longer dependent on his choices. Some people might say I was too harsh, that family should forgive everything, that unconditional love means accepting unacceptable behavior indefinitely. But here's what I've learned about unconditional love. It doesn't mean unconditional enabling. Real love sometimes requires saying no, setting boundaries, and allowing the people we care about to experience the consequences of their choices so they can learn to make better ones. The greatest gift I gave Vincent wasn't 5 years of unconditional support. It was finally forcing him to develop the skills and character necessary to support himself. The greatest gift I gave myself wasn't revenge against someone who'd wronged me. It was permission to value my own life as much as I'd valued his. And here's the question I want to leave you with, because this story isn't really about me and Vincent. It's about the dynamics that exist in families everywhere, the subtle ways that love can become manipulation and sacrifice can become self-destruction. Look at your own relationships, your own patterns of giving and receiving. Are you supporting someone's growth, or are you enabling their stagnation? Are you being loved, or are you being used? Are you teaching the people in your life to value what you give, or are you teaching them to take it for granted? Most importantly, if someone in your life treats you like you're old and useless, while you're sacrificing everything to support them, what are you going to do about it? Because here's what I learned at 68 years old: it's never too late to choose yourself, it's never too late to demand better, and it's never too late to discover that the most radical act of love is sometimes learning to say no. Your life matters. Your dreams matter. Your peace matters. And anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve access to your love, your energy, or your kitchen counter. What's your story? Have you ever been in a situation where someone's love became a weapon against you? How did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage to choose better. And if this story helped you see your own situation more clearly, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in impossible situations. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting free. Thank you for listening to my story. And thank you for being here.